The glossy paper landed on my Royal Doulton dinner plate with a soft, insulting smack right on top of my leftover roast beef. I didn't flinch. I just stared at the brochure. The cover featured a stock photo of a gray-haired couple smiling vacuously in front of a sterile beige building. Shady Pines Assisted Living. Your next chapter, I looked up. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, was standing at the head of my dining table, her arms crossed over her designer silket blouse. She had the kind of cold, calculating eyes that assessed everything in terms of square footage and market value. "Pack your bags, old man," she said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that didn't even bother to hide itself anymore. "We've already paid the deposit. You're moving out on Friday. This house is ours now." I shifted my gaze to my son, David. He was sitting across from me, intensely studying the scuff marks on his expensive Italian loafers. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. The silence in the dining room of the home I had built 30 years ago was deafening. "Is that so?" I asked gently. I picked up my linen napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and reached for my glass of Cabernet. "Don't play dumb, Arthur," Chloe scoffed, leaning forward. "This property is too big for you. It's an asset being wasted on a man who spends his days trimming rose bushes. I'm next in line to be partner at Vanguard Holdings, and I need a property of this caliber to host events. We're doing you a favor. They have bingo on Tuesdays." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. The vintage was excellent. Then I reached beneath the table and pulled out a thick, navy blue legal folder. I placed it over the nursing home brochure. I smiled. Not a warm smile, but the kind of smile a trap makes right before it snaps shut. "Funny you should say that, Chloe," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to echo off the vaulted ceiling. "Because I just sold this house yesterday to your boss." The color instantly drained from Chloe's perfectly made-up face. Her jaw went slack. The smug superiority vanished, replaced by a sudden, hollow panic. Even David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a terror I hadn't seen since he was a boy who broke a window. You're lying," Chloe stammered, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. "Marcus Sterling doesn't buy residential real estate from nobodies." "Oh, he doesn't," I agreed softly. "But he does buy from the man who saved him from bankruptcy 20 years ago." As Chloe's mouth opened and closed, like a fish suffocating on dry land, I leaned back in my chair. To understand the look of absolute destruction on my daughter-in-law's face, and the shame radiating from my only son, we have to rewind the clock. How did I, a 64-year-old retired architect and widower living a quiet life, end up setting such a ruthless, elaborate trap for my own flesh and blood? It all started 4 weeks ago, with a stranger standing in my garden. 4 weeks earlier, it was a crisp Tuesday morning. The kind of morning my late wife, Helen, would have loved. I was out by the east wing of the estate, wearing my old canvas jacket, carefully pruning the hydrangeas. This house was my masterpiece. I had spent my career designing commercial skyscrapers in Chicago, but this home in Oak Brook was built with love, sweat, and my own hands. Every stone, every archway, every piece of crown molding had a memory attached to it. I heard the crunch of gravel before I saw him. A young man in a cheap suit was standing near the property line, holding a laser tape measure and scribbling frantically on a clipboard. He looked up, startled, as I emerged from behind the hedges with my pruning shears. "Can I help you?" I asked. He offered a nervous, professional smile. "Oh, sorry, didn't mean to intrude. Just finishing up the exterior appraisal. Beautiful property, by the way. The new zoning laws in this district really bumped up the value. You could turn this place into a boutique hotel if you wanted to." I frowned, lowering the shears. "Appraisal? I didn't order an appraisal. The house is paid off." The young man checked his clipboard, looking confused. "Really? I have a work order here. Ordered by the future owner, a Ms. Chloe Pendleton. She said the current resident was moving into a care facility and the property was being transferred." A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my chest, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones. "I see," I said, forcing my voice to remain remarkably steady. "There must be a slight miscommunication with the paperwork. Carry on." I turned and walked back into the house. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I walked straight into my study and locked the oak door behind me. Chloe, future owner, David and Chloe had visited for dinner 3 days ago. David had been unusually quiet, leaving his leather briefcase in the living room by the sofa when he went to the kitchen to fetch another bottle of wine. I remembered him being frantic when he couldn't find it right away before they left, eventually discovering it tucked behind a throw pillow. I walked over to the living room. It was a long shot, but I knew my son. He was careless. I lifted the heavy sofa cushions. Nothing. I checked behind the armchair. Nothing. Then I looked under the antique side table next to where the briefcase had been resting. There, lying flat against the Persian rug, was a crumpled piece of paper that must have slipped out of the side pocket. I picked it up. My hands were shaking. It was a draft of a quitclaim deed. It listed me, Arthur Pendleton, as the grantor, transferring the entirety of my estate to David and Chloe Pendleton. At the bottom, there was a blank line for my signature, next to a sticky note in Chloe's neat, aggressive handwriting. Get the old man to sign this weekend. Pretend it's for his Medicare trust. My own son was trying to steal my home. But why? I didn't confront them immediately. In my years of negotiating multi-million-dollar commercial developments, I learned one ironclad rule. Never show your hand until you know what cards the other guy is holding. I needed to know if David was a victim of Chloe's ambition or a willing accomplice. I needed to give my son a chance to be a man. I called David that afternoon and invited him out to Lake Michigan for some early morning fishing on Saturday. Just the two of us, like the old days. To my surprise, he agreed. The water was choppy, the sky the color of bruised iron. David sat at the back of my old Boston whaler, aggressively reeling in an empty line. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he kept checking his phone despite the lack of signal. "You seem stressed, Davy," I said casually, threading a worm onto my hook. "Work getting to you?" He sighed, not looking at me. "Just the usual. Market is tough. You know," I said, casting my line out into the gray water. "If you and Chloe are ever in a tight spot, you can talk to me. I'm not just a retired old man puttering in the garden. I've navigated a few financial storms in my time." I watched him closely. I gave him the perfect opening. All he had to do was say, "Dad, I'm in trouble." If he had, I would have moved mountains to help him. I would have written a check that very day. Instead, David scoffed. "We're fine, Dad. Chloe is killing it at Vanguard. Actually, we're more worried about you." "Me?" "Yeah." He finally looked at me, and I saw the lie swimming in his eyes. "That house, it's too big. The stairs are dangerous. Chloe was saying just the other day that you'd be much safer, much happier, in a place with 24-hour care, where you don't have to worry about maintenance." The bait was rejected. He wasn't asking for help. He was laying the groundwork for the theft. "I manage just fine," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "For now," David muttered, turning back to the water, "but things change." When I dropped him off at his upscale downtown condo, he didn't even look back to wave. I drove home with a heart made of lead. If he was in on it, how far had they already gone? I went straight to my master bedroom and pulled aside the painting that hid my wall safe. I spun the dial, 32-14-49, my late wife's birthday. The heavy metal door clicked open. I pulled out my metal lockbox where I kept my will, life insurance policies, and the original deed to the house. I flipped through the thick, yellowing parchment papers. I stopped. I counted them again. I emptied the box onto the bed. The original property deed was gone, and only one other person in the world knew the combination to that safe. My son. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark of my study, nursing a glass of scotch, watching the moon cast long shadows across the oak floors. Grief is a strange thing. At first it paralyzes you, but when betrayal is mixed into it, the grief hardens. It crystallizes into a cold, sharp focus. They weren't just taking my house. They were attempting to erase my legacy, my independence, and my dignity. I wouldn't allow it. I needed a complete picture of the battlefield. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called Greg. Greg and I went way back. He was a senior risk analyst at the biggest bank in Chicago. "Arthur, you old ghost," Greg chuckled. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need a favor, Greg. Off the books. I need to know the financial health of my son, David Pendleton." There was a pause. "Arthur, you know the privacy laws." "Greg, 30 years ago, I fronted you the cash to keep your brother out of federal prison. I'm calling in the marker." An hour later, Greg called back. His voice was grim. It's bad, Artie. Really bad. David has taken out 3 massive personal loans against his condo, and they're all underwater. He's been heavily involved in some unregulated crypto margins and offshore sports betting. He owes about $400,000. The bank is initiating foreclosure on his condo next week. They are desperate. I hung up the phone. The puzzle pieces clicked together. It wasn't just Chloe's ambition, it was David's survival. They needed a massive asset to use as collateral. Or David was going to lose everything, possibly even face fraud charges of his own. My house, worth over $3 million unencumbered, was their life raft, and they were willing to drown me to take it. As I sat there digesting the ugly truth, I saw the mailman drop a bundle into the brass slot on my front door. I shuffled out to the foyer and picked up the letters. Mostly junk mail, a utility bill. But there was one thick, cream-colored envelope. It was addressed to Chloe Pendleton, but it bore my home address. A clerical error by a vendor, no doubt. I opened it without hesitation. It was an invoice and a mock-up from an elite event planning agency in the city. The total quote was for $50,000. The header read, Vanguard Holdings Executive Board Gala, celebrating the appointment of senior partner, Chloe Pendleton. The date was set for exactly 4 weeks from today. The location? My address. She was already planning her victory party in my living room. She was selling the skin before she even shot the bear. I looked closely at the Vanguard Holdings logo printed on the mock-up. A stylized V shaped like a shield. I knew that logo. I walked over to my bookshelf, pulled down an old architectural portfolio from 1999, and flipped to a project titled The Onion Building. The client listed on the blueprint was a young, frantic 20-something named Marcus Sterling, founder of Vanguard Holdings, a man who once sat in this very study, crying because his investors were pulling out, until I stepped in and guaranteed his construction loan with my own firm's money. I looked at the invoice in my hand, then at the blueprint. A genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in days. "You picked the wrong house, Chloe," I whispered to the empty room. I picked up the phone and dialed the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Holdings. It was time to arrange a reunion. The corporate switchboard for Vanguard Holdings was a labyrinth of automated menus and hold music designed to make you give up. When I finally reached a human being, she sounded like a woman who deflected billionaires for a living. "Office of the CEO, Mr. Sterling's desk. How may I direct your call?" Her voice was crisp, perfectly modulated, and utterly indifferent. "Good afternoon. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I need to speak with Marcus." "I'm sorry, Mr. Pendleton, but Mr. Sterling's schedule is entirely booked for the next 3 months. If you'd like to leave a message, or perhaps I can direct you to our acquisitions department." "I don't want acquisitions," I said smoothly. "Just tell Marcus that the man holding the original blueprints to the Onion Building is on the line. I'll wait." "Sir," as I said, "just tell him, please." I heard a heavy sigh, followed by the click of the hold line. I listened to a smooth jazz saxophone for exactly 14 seconds before the line violently clicked back over. "Arthur? Arthur Pendleton? Is that really you?" Marcus Sterling's voice was deeper now, gravelly with years of shouting across boardrooms, but the underlying frantic energy of the 20-something kid I once knew was still there. "Hello, Marcus. It's been a while. I hear you're running half the commercial real estate in the Midwest now." He let out a booming laugh. "Only the profitable half, Artie. My God, it's been what, 15 years? Since Helen's funeral? How are you holding up, you old badger?" "I'm alive," I said, "but I have a bit of a situation. It involves a senior VP at your firm, Chloe Pendleton." The warmth in Marcus's voice instantly cooled into a sharp, professional edge. "Chloe, your daughter-in-law? She's a shark?" "Arthur. Good numbers, but a bit too eager for the corner office. Has she done something?" "I think it's better if I show you. Any chance you have time for a scotch with a retired architect today?" "For you, Arthur? I'll clear my afternoon. I'll be at your estate in an hour." I hung up the phone. The gatekeeper was bypassed. The board was set. Marcus arrived in a sleek Blacktown car. He stepped out wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, his temples graying, but he stopped and stared at my house with the same wide-eyed reverence he had 20 years ago. I met him at the door and led him into my study. I poured 2 fingers of Macallan 18 into crystal tumblers. This place is still a masterpiece. Artie, Marcus said, taking a seat in the leather wingback chair. I tried to buy a place in this zip code last year. The new zoning laws are making this land a gold mine for elite corporate retreats. I know, I said, handing him his glass. And so does Chloe. I didn't waste time. I placed the draft of the quitclaim deed I had found on the table. Then I placed the $50,000 event invoice next to it. Marcus picked up the invoice. His eyes scanned the Vanguard logo, the date, and the title. Celebrating the appointment of senior partner, Chloe Pendleton. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. Marcus was a ruthless businessman, but he built his empire on loyalty and protocol. What he was looking at was a blatant violation of both. She authorized this. Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet. Using the company logo, declaring herself a senior partner before the board has even voted. She plans to steal this house from me, Marcus. She and my son, David, are deeply in debt. They are trying to force me into a nursing home and use this estate to climb your corporate ladder and bail themselves out. Marcus threw the invoice onto the table in disgust. The arrogance, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance. I was actually considering her for the partnership, Arthur. But this? If she's willing to stab her own family in the back and forge company authority, she'll do it to Vanguard next. He looked up at me. I'll fire her tomorrow. I'll have security drag her out by her designer heels. No, I said, holding up a hand. That's too easy. If you just fire her, they'll still come after me. I need them stopped permanently, and I need to secure my home. Marcus leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. What do you have in mind, old friend? You mentioned you wanted a property in this zip code for corporate retreats. Buy this house from me, today, in cash. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Arthur, you love this house. You built it. I did, which is why I will only sell it to Vanguard under a life estate agreement. You own the deed, you pay the property taxes, and you can renovate the East Wing into your VIP boardroom right now. But I retain the legal right to live in the main house, undisturbed, until the day I die. A slow, predatory smile spread across Marcus's face. He saw the genius of it. He was getting a prime piece of real estate at a discount, and I was getting absolute legal armor. Consider it done, Marcus said, raising his glass. We'll close the deal silently by Friday. But how do we handle Chloe and your son? I clinked my glass against his. We let them think they've won. We let them dig their own graves. If you want to catch a rat, you have to play dead. The next few weeks were a masterclass in swallowed pride. When David and Chloe came over for their weekly visits, I stopped being the sharp-witted architect. I became the doddering, confused old man they desperately wanted me to be. I would forget where I put my glasses while they were on my head. I would ask David the same question 3 times in 10 minutes. I even let my hands shake a little when I poured the tea. It was agonizing. Not the acting, but watching my son's reaction. There was no pity in David's eyes. There was only relief. He was relieved that I was deteriorating, because it made his betrayal easier to justify. Chloe, on the other hand, became bolder. She started walking around my house with a tape measure, loudly discussing with David which walls they were going to knock down. The antique mahogany has to go, she said one evening, gesturing to my late wife's favorite dining set while I was sitting right there. It's too depressing. We'll bring in glass and steel. Whatever you think is best, babe, David muttered, checking his phone. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. It was a Thursday evening. David showed up unannounced, carrying a manila folder. He looked sweaty, his eyes darting around nervously. The bank's foreclosure deadline was looming. He was out of time. Hey, Dad, he said, his voice overly cheerful. I brought some paperwork for you. Paperwork? I asked, putting down my newspaper and blinking slowly. Is it my tax returns? I thought Henderson handled those. No, Dad. It's Medicare restructuring forms. The government is changing how they handle senior assets. You just need to sign here, and I'll take care of the rest. It'll make sure your medical bills are covered. He placed the document on the coffee table. He had folded the top half over so I couldn't see the header, but I didn't need to see it to know what it was. It was a general power of attorney. If I signed it, I was legally handing him the keys to my kingdom. I would be powerless. Oh my, I murmured, patting my pockets. Medicare, you say? Well, you always were good with numbers, Davy. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my favorite silver fountain pen. It was the moment of truth. I slowly uncapped the silver pen. David leaned in closer, his breath shallow. "Just right here on the line, Dad. And date it, please." I let my hand tremble slightly as I pressed the nib to the paper. I wrote my name, Arthur Thomas Pendleton, in my usual flowing cursive. David practically snatched the paper off the table the second the ink was dry. "Great, thanks. Dad, I'll file this tomorrow," he said, already backing toward the door. He couldn't get out of my house fast enough. "Leaving so soon?" I called out weakly. "I made a pot of decaf. Busy week at work, Dad? Love you." And the front door slammed shut. I sat there in the silence, the facade dropping instantly. I stood up, walked over to my desk, and looked at the silver pen in my hand. I had bought it 3 days ago from a specialty novelty shop in downtown Chicago. The ink was a chemical compound used by tailors and sometimes magicians. It looked perfectly black and permanent when applied, but exposed to the air, it completely evaporated in less than 12 hours. The next morning, I made myself a cup of black coffee and walked into my study. Behind the volumes of architectural encyclopedias on the top shelf, the tiny red light of a motion-activated hidden camera blinked quietly. I had installed it pointing directly at my antique writing desk. I pulled out my laptop and connected to the camera's feed. The night before, David had come back to the house while I was asleep. He had a key, of course. I watched the black and white footage. The timestamp showed 1:15 a.m. David crept into my study, turning on only a small desk lamp. He pulled the power of attorney document out of his coat. On the screen, I watched him freeze. He tapped the paper. He rubbed his eyes. The signature he had watched me write was gone. The line was completely blank. Panic set in. He frantically searched my desk for a pen. He found a standard blue ballpoint. But he knew he couldn't just write my name. The bank would check the signature against my files. So my son did exactly what I knew his desperate, cornered mind would force him to do. He pulled out an old birthday card I had given him, placed it next to the legal document, and hunched over the desk. For 20 agonizing minutes, the camera recorded David in high definition as he meticulously traced, practiced, and forged my signature onto the power of attorney. When he was done, he blew on the ink, smiled, and slipped back out into the night. I paused the video on a clear, tight shot of his face as he forged the document. I hit export. My son and his wife had crossed the line from greedy relatives to federal felons, and I had the receipt. The trap was fully armed. All that was left was for them to step on the trigger. Friday morning arrived with a heavy, gray overcast, fitting weather for burying the past. I drove downtown to the gleaming glass and steel skyscraper that housed Vanguard Holdings. I bypassed the main reception and took the private elevator directly to Marcus Sterling's executive suite. Marcus was waiting for me with his lead corporate attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Vance. "Arthur," Marcus greeted me, his handshake firm. "Everything is prepared." Mrs. Vance slid a thick stack of documents across the polished marble conference table. "Mr. Pendleton, this is the commercial purchase agreement. Vanguard Holdings agrees to purchase the Oakbrook estate for $2.8 million in cash. The funds will be wired directly into your anonymous blind trust upon signing." She pulled out a second, slimmer document. "And this is the life estate addendum. It legally guarantees you the absolute right to occupy, use, and control the primary residence of the property for the remainder of your natural life. Vanguard cannot evict you, nor can they sell the property without honoring this tenancy." I read every line carefully. It was airtight. I wasn't just selling my house, I was turning it into a fortress. I took out my regular fountain pen, the real one, and signed my name on the dotted lines. The heavy thud of Ms. Vance's notary stamp echoed in the quiet room. It was done. I no longer owned the house, but I was safer than I had ever been. "The transfer will be recorded with the county clerk by noon today," Ms. Vance confirmed, packing the documents into her leather briefcase. "Thank you, Ms. Vance," I said. Once she left, Marcus poured us both a cup of black coffee. He looked at me, a dangerous glint in his eye. "So, when does the hammer fall?" My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the text message that had just flashed on the screen. It was from Chloe. "Dad, David and I are coming over for Sunday dinner. We have some very important family business to discuss. See you at 6, I showed the screen to Marcus. Sunday at 6, I said softly. Marcus smiled, adjusting his silk tie. I'll make sure my schedule is clear. I wouldn't miss this dinner for the world. And that brings us back to the Sunday dinner. I sat at the head of the table, the nursing home brochure resting next to my wine glass, the navy blue legal folder under my hands. I just sold this house yesterday. To your boss, I said. The silence that followed my words was thick enough to choke on. Chloe stared at me, her face pale, her lips parted in shock. David looked like he was going to be sick. You're crazy, Chloe finally snapped, her voice shrill, trying to regain control. You're senile, Arthur. You haven't spoken to Marcus Sterling. Vanguard doesn't buy residential properties from retirees. You're just trying to scare us. Am I? I asked calmly. Chloe stood up, slamming her hands flat on the dining table. The silverware rattled. Yes, you are. But it doesn't matter what lies you tell yourself, old man. She sneered, reaching into her designer handbag. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and slapped it on the table. Because as of Thursday, you don't have the legal capacity to sell a damn thing. She pointed a manicured finger at the document. This is a general power of attorney, signed by you, Arthur. It grants David full control over your assets, your finances, and your medical decisions. We took it to the county clerk on Friday afternoon and filed it. We are in charge now. She looked at me with triumphant malice. We already initiated the transfer of the deed to our names. You're done, Arthur. The house is ours, and you are going to Shady Pines on Friday. David kept his eyes glued to the table, sweating profusely. Dad, just make it easy. We had to do it. I was drowning. I looked at the forged document. I looked at the son I had raised. All the residual guilt I had about what I was about to do vanished, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. I picked up my silver spoon and gently tapped it against my crystal wine glass. Clink, clink. Right on cue, the heavy oak front door opened. Heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer, approaching the dining room. Chloe turned around, ready to yell at whoever was intruding, but the words died in her throat. Marcus Sterling stood in the archway of my dining room. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a dark overcoat, looking every inch the ruthless corporate titan he was. Behind him stood Ms. Vance, clutching her briefcase. Chloe's knees physically buckled. She grabbed the back of her chair to keep from falling. Mr. Sterling, she whispered, her voice trembling. What are you doing here? Marcus looked at her with a disgust so profound it made the room feel 10 degrees colder. I'm inspecting my new property, Chloe, Marcus said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. Marcus walked into the room, stopping right next to my chair. He didn't even look at David. His predatory focus was entirely on Chloe. Arthur is right, Chloe, Marcus said. Vanguard Holdings closed on this estate on Friday morning. Cash deal. The deed is already recorded in the company's name. No! Chloe shrieked, panic breaking through her carefully constructed facade. He couldn't have. I have the power of attorney. It was filed on Friday afternoon. My filing supersedes his. Ms. Vance stepped forward, pulling a certified copy of the deed transfer from her briefcase. She laid it on the table next to Chloe's forged document. Actually, Ms. Pendleton, Ms. Vance said clinically, Mr. Pendleton and Vanguard executed the sale at 9:00 a.m. on Friday. The county clerk timestamped the transfer at 11:30 a.m. Your power of attorney wasn't filed until 3 p.m. By the time you tried to claim the asset, Mr. Pendleton no longer owned it. Chloe stared at the timestamp on Vanguard's deed. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her grand plan, her collateral, her venue for her victory party. It was all dust. Speaking of parties, Marcus interjected, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and tossing it onto the table. It was the $50,000 event invoice. You authorized a corporate gala using my company's funds and my company's logo. At a private residence, you were trying to steal from a vulnerable senior citizen, Marcus said, his voice rising in volume. You declared yourself a senior partner without a board vote. Do you have any idea the level of liability and fraud you've exposed Vanguard to? Marcus, please, I can explain, Chloe begged, tears finally welling in her eyes. Shut up, Marcus snapped. You are terminated, effective immediately. Ms. Vance will be serving you with a lawsuit for corporate fraud and misappropriation of funds on Monday. You will never work in real estate in this hemisphere again." Chloe collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The shark had been gutted, but David wasn't a shark. He was a cornered rat. David suddenly shot up from his chair, grabbing the power of attorney document. "Wait! This doesn't matter!" he yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I still have this. I control his bank accounts. If Vanguard paid him $2.8 million in cash, that money is his, which means I control the money. We can still pay off the debts." He looked at me, his eyes wide and wild. "Right, Dad? You sold the house, but the money is yours. I can legally take it right now." I looked up at my son. It was the final nail in his own coffin. "You don't control anything, David," I said softly. I opened my navy blue folder and pulled out the final trap. I laid two things on the table: a forensic handwriting analysis report from an independent expert and an iPad. I tapped the screen of the iPad. The black and white video began to play. The dining room went dead silent as the video showed David creeping into my study at 1:15 a.m. It showed him realizing the ink had vanished. It showed him pulling out the old birthday card. And it showed a crystal clear, zoomed-in shot of David meticulously forging my signature onto the power of attorney. David dropped the document as if it had caught fire. He stumbled backward, knocking his chair over with a loud crash. Dad, how did you?" "I used disappearing ink, David," I said, my voice steady, though my heart ached with a profound, terrible sadness. "I gave you every chance. I asked you on the boat if you were in trouble. I opened the door for you to ask for help as my son. Instead, you chose to treat me like a mark." I stood up from the table. "You thought I was just a senile old man you could discard. You forgot that I spent 40 years writing ironclad contracts and dealing with cutthroat developers. You forgot who built this house." I picked up the forged document. "This isn't a family dispute over a house anymore, David," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "This is forgery in the second degree, a Class 3 felony in the state of Illinois." "Dad, no, please." David dropped to his knees, his hands clasped together, sobbing. "The bank, they're going to take my condo. The bookies, I owe so much money. If you send me to jail, I'm dead. You're my father. And you are my son," I replied. "Which is why I have to stop you before you destroy yourself completely." Outside the dining room windows, the quiet suburban street was suddenly bathed in flashing red and blue lights. The wail of a siren died down as two police cruisers pulled into my circular driveway. I had called them 20 minutes before dinner started. "I'm sorry, David," I said, turning my back to him as the heavy knock sounded at the front door. "But your next chapter doesn't start here." The two Oak Brook police officers stepped into the dining room, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The flashing lights from outside cast a surreal, strobing glow over the remnants of my Sunday roast. "Arthur Pendleton?" the lead officer asked. "That's me, officer," I replied calmly. I handed him the iPad and the folder containing the forensic report and the forged power of attorney. "Everything you need is right here. The suspect is the man on the floor." David didn't even try to run. He just sat there amidst the overturned chairs, weeping into his hands as the officers hauled him to his feet. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping around his wrists was the loudest sound in the room. Chloe backed away against the wall, her eyes wide with terror, desperately trying to put physical distance between herself and her husband. "I had nothing to do with this," she cried out to the officers. "He did it. I didn't forge anything." Marcus let out a short, cynical laugh. "Loyal to the bitter end, aren't you, Chloe?" As the police led a sobbing David out the front door, reading him his Miranda rights, Chloe grabbed her designer purse and bolted out the back door into the night, leaving her car, her husband, and her shattered ambitions behind. The real fallout, however, came the next morning. On Monday at 10 a.m., I was back at Vanguard Holdings, sitting in Marcus's office to finalize the setup of my blind trust. As I sipped my espresso, a commotion echoed from the glass-walled corridor outside. I turned my chair just in time to see the show. Chloe Pendleton was doing the corporate perp walk. She was flanked by two burly security guards. In her arms, she carried a single cardboard box containing a potted succulent, a frame degree, and a few desk trinkets. Her hair was unkempt, her makeup smudged. As she was marched past the open floor of cubicles and glass offices, dozens of junior associates and executives stopped to watch. The whispers were loud enough to hear through the glass. The rising star of Vanguard was being publicly thrown out like yesterday's garbage. For a brief second, as she passed Marcus's office, she looked through the glass and locked eyes with me. There was no anger left in her gaze, only the hollow, devastated realization that she had played Russian roulette with a loaded gun, and she had pulled the trigger herself. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just took a sip of my espresso and turned away. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. The caller ID read, "Inmate call, Cook Kankakee Correctional." I looked at Marcus. He gave me a somber nod. "I have to take this," I said. The visitor's room at the county jail smelled of bleach, stale sweat, and despair. I sat on a hard plastic chair, staring through a thick pane of smudged plexiglass. When the heavy steel door opened, a guard escorted David to the booth opposite mine. Seeing my son in an oversized, bright orange jumpsuit, his shoulders slumped and his eyes bruised with exhaustion, broke my heart. But I had spent my life building structures designed to withstand immense pressure. I knew I couldn't let my foundation crack now. We picked up the heavy black receivers at the same time. "Dad," David choked out, tears instantly spilling down his cheeks. "Dad, please. It's awful in here. You have to post my bail. It's set at $50,000. You just got almost $3 million from the house. Please, just get me out of here." "I can't do that, David," I said. My voice was gentle but entirely unyielding. David stopped crying. A flash of desperate anger crossed his face. "What do you mean you can't? You have the money. I'm your son. You're just going to leave me in a cage?" "If I bail you out," I explained, "if I pay off your bookies and clear your debts, what happens next? You go back to the condo you're losing? You go back to Chloe, who I understand filed for an emergency annulment this morning to protect her own assets." David flinched as if I had physically struck him. She filed? She abandoned you the second the handcuffs came out, David. The money was the only thing holding your marriage together." I leaned closer to the glass. "You built your life on a rotten foundation. You gambled, you lied, and when the walls started collapsing, you tried to steal from your own father to patch the holes." "I was desperate," he pleaded. "Desperation is an emotion. Forgery is a choice," I countered. "I am not doing this to punish you, David. I am doing this to save you. Because if I bail you out now, you will never learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. You will just find another shortcut until it destroys you completely." He stared at me, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. The entitlement was draining away, replaced by genuine remorse. "I'll pay for a competent defense attorney," I told him. "I won't let the system railroad you. But you are going to face the judge. You are going to plead guilty to what you did. You are going to take the probation, or the sentence, or whatever the court decides. And you are going to rebuild your life, brick by brick, the right way." I placed my hand against the cold plexiglass. "When you finally do that, David, I'll be waiting for you, but not a second before." David looked at my hand through the glass. Slowly, his trembling hand came up and mirrored mine on the other side. He didn't argue anymore. He just nodded, crying silently. I hung up the phone, stood up, and walked out of the jail. When the heavy steel doors closed behind me, I stepped out into the bright morning sun. I took a deep, cleansing breath. The hardest part was over. 1 month later, the afternoon sun was pouring through the vaulted windows of my living room, casting warm, golden squares across the oak floors. From the east wing of the estate, I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of power drills and hammers. Vanguard Holdings had wasted no time. Marcus had sent over his best contractors, and they were busy transforming the old guest wing into a state-of-the-art executive retreat. But they were incredibly respectful. The construction stopped exactly at 5 p.m. every day, and they never once encroached on my half of the property. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of iced tea. I didn't have to worry about the property taxes anymore. I didn't have to worry about the landscaping bill, the roof maintenance, or the rising cost of utilities. Marcus's company covered it all, just as the life estate contract dictated. I had $3 million sitting safely in a blind trust, generating interest. More importantly, I had my sanctuary. I walked into the master bedroom. My vintage leather duffel bag was resting on the bed, half packed. Beside it sat a framed photograph of my late wife, Helen, laughing on a beach in Florida. I picked up the photo and smiled. "We're finally doing it, sweetheart," I whispered. For years, Helen and I had talked about spending a summer in Tuscany, renting a small villa, drinking wine, and sketching the old Renaissance architecture. After she passed, I had convinced myself I was too old, too tired, and too lonely to make the trip. I had been waiting to fade away. Chloe and David had sensed that weakness. They thought they could just sweep me into a sterile room at Shady Pines and claim the spoils of my hard work. They were wrong. Aging doesn't mean becoming invisible. It doesn't mean you lose your teeth, your mind, or your right to defend what is yours. Youth has energy, yes, and ambition. But age brings something far more dangerous to those who underestimate it. Patience, experience, the ability to see a trap, and the wisdom to build a better one. I zipped up the leather duffel bag and grabbed my passport from the nightstand. My flight to Florence departed in 4 hours. I took one last look around the beautiful home I had built. It was no longer a monument to the past. It was a foundation for my future. I picked up my bag, walked out the front door, and locked it behind me. The trap was sprung, the site was cleared, and it was a beautiful day to start building again.